The shrill alarm jolted Bob awake, his eyes snapping open to the unfamiliar surroundings of the Chevy's front seat. He groaned, rubbing his stiff neck. 5 nights, he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. The last time I slept in a bed was, I reckon, during the Ford administration. Ever since then I been livin' in this here Chevy. Of course I don't have to tell you that. Nasir, you surely don't, I replied, already slipping into the familiar rhythm of our routine. Bob had been living in this car for months, and his complaints were as predictable as the sunrise. We were parked on the west side of Elvis Presley Boulevard, right across from Graceland. The site was a mix of the familiar and the surreal. A dozen gift shops, a fenced-in compound with Elvis's tour bus and 2 airplanes, and a line of white raised ceiling vans waiting to transport tourists to the front porch of the king's home. The larger jet had a gold logo on its tail, a TCB with a lightning bolt underneath, a symbol of the man who once ruled this place. Bob raised an eyebrow and affected a pained look when he saw the tour would cost us $6. Isn't this great, an Elvis ashtray? I think I'll buy it. For bad taste, pink flamingos don't have a leg up on Elvis ashtrays. Well, wait until after the tour, I suggested, wanting to buy something myself. We're up next, and you aren't going to want to carry that around all day. Bob laughed and set it down. Okay, we'll come back, right after the tour. The van's 8-track tape player blared Rock a Hula Baby as the driver welcomed us to Graceland, shuttling us across the street. He told us we were among the 6,000 visitors who tour the mansion each of the 360 days it's open. 6,000 people, over 2 million a year. The front of the house was surprisingly humble, with gray stone walls, black shutters, and 4 modest white columns. It could have been a dormitory at a Midwestern women's college, if not for the steel bars covering all the windows. On the front porch, our guide Kelly, dressed in a blue pinstriped shirt, navy chinos, and perfect hair, told us that in 1957, at the age of 22, Elvis purchased Graceland and the 13.8 surrounding acres from Dr. and Mrs. Thomas Moore for $100,000 cash. That was a good year for Elvis. For precisely half of 1957, he had the #1 record in America. First Too Much, then All Shook Up, Teddy Bear, and Jailhouse Rock. I found it hard to imagine. I was now the same age that he was then, and I was living in a Chevy. There is still a family member living in the house today, Miss Delta Me Presley Biggs, said our guide. That is Elvis's aunt on his father's side. She's been living here since 1967, when she became a widow, and according to the estate, she is welcome to live here as long as she pleases. Our group didn't seem to notice Kelly's flustered moment. Most of us were too busy gawking, half expecting to see the frail old woman return from the grocery store. Inside, the house was a mix of the mundane and the extravagant. The dining room, built for 6, usually accommodated a dozen guests, and Elvis always sat at the head of the table, not because he considered himself the man of the family, but because it gave him the best view of the TV set. There were 14 televisions in the house, and Elvis was an avid TV watcher. In the living room, we saw a custom-built 15-foot sofa, a 10-foot coffee table, and framed photographs of family members. Beyond the couch were stained glass partitions decorated with peacocks, Elvis's favorite bird. A short, pretty, 60-ish woman next to me chuckled. 14 televisions, 14 peacocks. That's some kind of coincidence, isn't it? I agreed, and she introduced herself as Chloe. I'm an Elvis fan from way back, you know, she said. My students told me about him back in 1955. I was teaching in Minnesota then, microbiology. The first rooms were fairly subdued with whites and grays, but the basement was a different story. The TV room was done in bright yellow and blue, and the pool room featured 750 yards of pleated fabric on the walls and ceiling. We were assured that the rip on the pool table wasn't made by Elvis, but by a friend trying to execute a trick shot. Surveillance cameras were installed throughout the house in the early 70s. The jungle room, added in 1965, was the only room Elvis decorated himself. It had a broken waterfall, rampant ferns, and sofas and chairs covered in pseudo-animal hide. The acoustics were good enough to record 2 albums here, and Elvis ate his breakfast at a polished cypress coffee table. When we stepped outside, we saw a portion of the Presley motor pool. Motorcycles, a Dino Ferrari, 2 Stutz Bearcats, and a 1955 pink Cadillac. We could take pictures in a fringe-topped pink Jeep, or on one of Elvis's snowmobiles, which had go cartwheels instead of skis because there was no snow in Memphis. Chloe declined to have her picture taken, finding it a bit ghoulish. "But I do suppose they'll make a good souvenir for you boys," she said, handing me my camera. The trophy room, once a garage-sized building housing Elvis's slot car track, was now a museum. The first room arranged memorabilia chronologically, from photos of Elvis growing up in Tupelo to his draft notice, movie scripts, and a pile of gold and platinum records. The second room was dedicated to his gold and platinum records, and the third room was a mix of everything else, his wedding cake, guitars, and jewelry. But the most striking display was the unfinished jumpsuit, the color of the deep end of a municipal swimming pool. Elvis was scheduled to wear it on stage August 17, 1977, but he died the day before. The contrast between what the man achieved and what he had become was stark and immediate. We walked into the sun and out to the memorial garden, where the graves of Elvis, his stillborn twin, his mother, his father, and his grandmother were arranged in a semicircle, with Elvis in the center. Flowers were strewn across the bronze tablets, and the graves of Elvis and his mother had the most arrangements. People studied and photographed the inscriptions, but few cried or made any sort of noise. As we walked away, Chloe shook her head and spoke to no one. The van dropped us off back at the airplane holding pen, and I convinced Bob that despite the extra $3 admission, our trip to Memphis wouldn't be complete without the adjunct tour through Elvis Presley's private plane, the Lisa Marie. This tour had its own gift shop, filled with framed flight documents. One of them caught Bob's eye, a flight from Memphis to Denver, commissioned on Groundhog Day of 1976, for peanut butter and banana sandwiches. "God, then it must be real," Bob said, pointing to the frame. "I just thought this was one of those apocryphal celebrity legends, like George Washington and the cherry tree." But there they were, the flight papers from a twisted journey that defined obscene wealth. Late that night, Elvis and his entourage flew to Denver for sandwiches, then returned, the entire trip taking fewer than 5 hours and requiring 42,000 gallons of fuel. The tour continued, and Bob and I followed, our minds still reeling from the surreal day at Graceland. Bob and I were standing in front of the Lisa Marie, Elvis Presley's private jet. The plane was a time capsule of the 1970s, with velour seats and gold-flaked bathroom fixtures. It was a bit cheesy, but you couldn't help but admire how comfortable it all was. I overheard our guide, a young girl with beauty pageant hair, talking about a flight where Elvis insisted the crew eat his famous peanut butter sandwiches. She seemed a bit uncomfortable, like she was testifying in court. The tour guide explained that Elvis bought the plane to overcome his fear of flying. He used to tour in a converted bus, just like any other country and Western act. The plane was a symbol of his success, but it also felt a bit out of place, like a lot of things from the 1970s. I had a question for the guide. "How can you listen to Elvis all day? Don't you ever get tired of it?" She smiled, her curls staying perfectly in place. "Actually, no, it grows on you. You start listening to it in your spare time, too." I couldn't believe it. "Really? You listen to Elvis in your free time?" "Yeah, really. It's easy to get hyped up about it. It just becomes a part of you." I found this hard to believe, but I didn't push it. Instead, I caught up with Bob, who was trying to take a picture of the TCB logo on the plane's tail. You won't believe what she said. I told him and filled him in on our conversation. Bob was skeptical. "I bet they have to go to classes to learn all this. It probably takes months." Later, we found a Graceland employee named Anne who seemed a bit more relaxed. "Is there a script?" I asked her. She laughed. 92 pages. We all have to learn it. Every room, every speech. "So if I asked you the speech for the Jungle Room, in my sleep," she said. We chatted for a bit. Anne was a student at Memphis State, and this was just a summer job for her. When Bob asked if she listened to Elvis at home, she scrunched up her face. "Get serious. I don't even listen to him here." We saw a little boy in a shiny Elvis jumpsuit, and I couldn't help but think it was a bit cruel. Anne agreed. "We see a few of those a week. It's not a good look." As we were about to leave, I asked her about going upstairs at Graceland. Nobody ever gets to go up there, right? Not a thing. They say Elvis's bedroom is over the living room. Supposedly, nobody's been in there since he died. but there's bound to be some weirdness up there. We decided to visit the Graceland Tourist Information Center to get some more ideas. The air conditioning was a big draw. I asked the lady there what else we should see in Memphis. She pulled out a map and started circling everything in pink. How about Mud Island? It's only $3 and most people really like it. Bob and I agreed to check it out. On our way there, we met two young women who were also heading to Mud Island. They were lost, so we offered to lead them. Thanks, they called as they drove past us. Once we got to Mud Island, we realized we had forgotten to buy an Elvis ashtray. Bob was disappointed. The road to hell is paved with unbought Elvis ashtrays, he said. We parked and decided to check out the main attraction, a massive scale model of the Mississippi River. It was detailed and impressive, but Bob was tired. He walked quickly, pausing only to take a picture of me doing a Godzilla impression on a bridge. I wanted to learn more, but I could see Bob was done. We walked down to the beach and took some photos that were supposed to look like the D-Day invasion. We checked the gift shop for Elvis souvenirs, but found nothing worth buying. On our way back to Memphis, we stopped at the Chamber of Commerce to ask about Sun Records, but it was closed for remodeling. We had to settle for taking pictures with statues of Elvis and W.C. Handy on Beale Street. Back in the car, Bob was exhausted. He handed me the wheel and started singing gospel songs in a weird falsetto. We were just south of Chicago, and I could see the city waking up as we drove down the Dan Ryan Expressway. We pulled into David's dorm parking lot just as rush hour traffic was starting. The clock read 5:49. Probably a little early to wake David up, I said. Bob nodded. I'm going to write some postcards. I climbed out of the car and walked to the back, hopped on the trunk, and lit one of Bob's cigarettes with an official match of the 1984 Louisiana World Exposition. I watched the trains pass, the right profiles of thousands of commuters shooting by, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and nostalgia. Bob looked at me, surprised. I thought you didn't smoke, he said. Where'd you put those postcard stamps? I have no idea. I shrugged, still entranced by the trains. David Grettick's sister, Kirsten, was my first crush. We were both in Miss Cuff's morning kindergarten class in 1966, and she was the only other kid who could read. But what really caught my attention was how fast she ran on the kickball field. My heart raced every time I saw her, and I dreamed of dragging her behind the piano for a quick kiss and some giggles, but it never happened. By 9th grade, we went to a Sadie Hawkins dance and watched 2 movies before she told me we were just friends. Despite that, we stayed friends, and she's one of the oldest friends I have. I walked up the stairs to David's dorm, remembering our past and feeling a mix of laughter and bittersweet memories. I snuck into Corcoran Hall, woke David up, and we caught up in the lobby. He was hungover, but still eager to hear about our trip to Elvis's grave. I told him the story, but it felt unfinished, like there was more to it. After catching up, we went back to his room, and I took a shower. The hot water felt like magic, and I soaked in it, dreaming of glitter, chrome, and brass-barreled guns. I took a long nap on the cheap carpet, and dreamed forgettable dreams. For the next 2 days, we took it easy. We browsed used bookstores, record shops, and thrift stores. We ate at quirky cafes where the kitchen staff spoke in a Southern European language. We played football on the shores of Lake Michigan until our towels and t-shirts blew into the lake. The zoo was closed because of the wind, and it was nice to just be lazy. When I was 8, my grandpa Bob taught me about baseball. He bought me a subscription to the Sporting News and took me to my first major league game in St. Louis. Bob Gibson pitched a 3-hitter that night, and I became a hopeless baseball fan. On family vacations, I always tried to stop for baseball games. We went to games in Montreal, Atlanta, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Houston, Arlington, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Chicago. Dad and Shari enjoyed the games for the food, but Mom humored me, listening to my baseball trivia. Chicago was on our way back to Bryan from the West, so we stopped there the most. The Cubs were Grandpa Bob's favorite team, and even though they never won a World Series, he never gave up on them. I wanted to see the Cubs play at Wrigley Field, so I bought a case of old-style beer and watched the game on a black and white TV in David's room. I thought about my baseball roots and felt a sense of nostalgia. The night before Brad Coleman's wedding, Bob and I went downtown to meet Kirsten after work. We rode the L for the first time and saw a mix of street performers breakdancers, a string duet, and a guy named Dan Hurley, who wrote 60-second novels for $5. We laughed at the absurdity of it all, and thought about doing something similar to make money. When we met Kirsten, she was excited for me and gently pinched my arm, saying, "I can't believe you're getting married. That's really terrific." After a few hours of dancing in Chicago's meat market bars, Bob and I took the L back to David's. The train was packed, and it stopped underground for what felt like forever. The heat was unbearable, and people were getting restless. Someone said the train ahead had crashed and we were stuck. We waited, feeling like we might never get out. Finally, the train started moving, and we cheered. When we got back to David's, I called Laura, and everything felt perfect. I hung up, feeling like I could conquer the world. We got even drunker, and spent the night at David's Punket classmate's apartment. I passed out in an old armchair, and when I woke up, Bob was sleeping on the couch, and Brad was about to get married. I wasn't hungover, but my back cracked when I stood up. I woke Bob, and we hurried back to David's dorm to get ready. The wedding was in Winnetka, and we were already running late. I had to pick up my jacket from the dry cleaners, and we were definitely going to be late. We finally got in the car, and Bob said, "You know, I've never before attended the wedding of someone who broke my nose." Brad had accidentally hit Bob during a fake fight in college, and Bob ended up in the hospital. We made it to the wedding just as it was ending. We slipped into a back pew on the bride's side, and I saw Brad and Margie turn around, looking more in love than ever. The reception was at the Urban Men's League, and I ran into my high school chemistry teacher, who reminded me of a prank I played on his son. After a while, I excused myself and got 2 martinis from the bar. It was a perfect day, and I felt a sense of joy and belonging, just like old times. The morning sun pierced through the car windows, making my head throb. I was still in the same clothes from the wedding, with my tie stuffed in my shirt pocket, and my blazer draped over me like a blanket. Bob, in the front seat, was rubbing his eyes and moaning. "God, I miss David's floor," I said, opening the car door and waiting for the energy to get out. "Is this Iowa? It looks like Iowa. It's Iowa, isn't it?" Bob groaned. "Illinois, I think. Western, I hope. Can you drive?" I asked for the trunk key and rummaged through my suitcase for deodorant, fresh underwear, a semi-clean t-shirt, and my ratty jeans. "Back in a sec," I said, heading to the men's room to change. The night before, Bob and I had decided to wait until midnight to leave the city. We ended up back in the singles bars on Rush Street, where I felt like I'd lost 67 IQ points. I tried to dance with a tall redhead, but my moves were terrible. She was from a town called Romeoville, which was about a half-hour away. "Oh, right," I said, feeling stupid. "I've read Romeo and Juliet." She looked at me like I was a joke and left. I found a corner bar stool and got stinking drunk. Bob showed up with a pretty, busty brunette. They kissed and swapped addresses before I passed out in the back of El Basurero. Now in the morning, I splashed cold water on my face and changed clothes. I put on a Cincinnati Reds ball cap and checked the map. We were in western Illinois, about 13 miles from the Ohio border. "Move over," I said to Bob. "I'm driving." Bob groaned again. "I have to change." He shuffled to the men's room, and I waited, feeling impatient. "We don't have all day," I said. Bob snickered. "Yes, we do. We have all day and then some." We hit the road, and the landscape was flat and uninteresting. It felt like we were driving through a cartoon, with the same gas stations, fast food places, and fireworks stands repeating over and over. The people in these places looked tired, like they'd been on the road for too long. We were making good time, so we decided to reward ourselves. I drove to Des Moines, where we stopped for gas and found an all-you-can-eat Sunday buffet. The restaurant had Bavarian decor, a waitress with an Australian accent, and piles of roast beef and green beans. Bob drove from there to Lincoln, where we saw the new movie, Ghostbusters. The theater was loud, with teenagers shouting at the screen. Bob and I couldn't help but talk too. When the characters were asked if they'd been in contact with Elvis, we both said, "Give us this day our daily Elvis," and high-fived. After the movie, we drove toward Colorado. The sun was setting, and it was a drab red. "We almost missed today," I said. "Geez, that was close, but our record's still perfect." Bob looked through his tape box. Have you seen Wall of Voodoo? The map showed 1,021 miles between Chicago and Denver. It was a long, boring drive through Iowa and Nebraska. When we hit eastern Colorado, it seemed like a cruel joke. The welcome sign was rough and surrounded by weeds. Welcome to colorful Colorado, it said. Sure, pal, Bob knew the area well. He'd been here a few times before. He recognized the fast food places, the gas stations, and the exits where his family had taken bathroom breaks. We could see the Rockies in the distance, but they were still over 100 miles away. We drove through small towns with a mix of Western and modern shops, all while the Rockies loomed over us. El Basurero chugged up the 31 miles from Loveland to Estes Park. We were preoccupied with not running out of gas, but mostly excited about a place to sleep and free food. We made it to the Estes Park Texaco just before noon. Bob said the tourist season hadn't started yet. The main intersection had a special traffic light cycle for pedestrians. The Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum was closed for remodeling. The Black Canyon Lodge was a short drive from Estes. It was a luxury place, far from the touristy downtown, and close to Rocky Mountain National Park. Bob's sister Joan saw us and told him to park El Basurero out of sight. Bob and Joan greeted each other like they lived nearby. Bob asked if there was a waiter's job open, but Joan wasn't sure. Bob and I took quick showers in Joan's cabin, then went into town for lunch with the rest of the Wakefield family. I come from a small family, just parents and siblings. I find big families fascinating, especially those made complex by divorce. The Wakefields had 7 siblings, and their names were confusing: Blaine, Bill, and Bob, Jane, Joan, and Jean. I found it easiest to remember the youngest, Polly, because her name broke the pattern. During lunch, I felt like I was watching a soap opera. I couldn't keep track of all the family members, but I was excited. In August, I would marry into this big, complex family. For now, I just focused on the food and the beautiful view of the Rockies. The first lunch in Estes Park set the tone for our stay. We ate at an open-air restaurant where Bob and his 3 sisters, along with their boyfriends, caught up on recent news. They put on a casual front, but I was surprised when they called my friend Robbie. It was the first time I'd heard anyone use that name for him. For everyone else, he was Bob, or less often, Robert. I joined in the conversation about our trip so far, though we were already starting to add a few embellishments. Mostly, I spent the lunch watching a guitarist who clearly wanted to be John Denver and sipping a ridiculous drink called a yard of ale. The glass was about 3 feet tall, and when it wasn't being used, it stood in a big wooden holder, making the drinker look like a lost shepherd in the mountains. Estes Park reminded me a bit of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, but it felt less commercial. There were taffy shops and rubber reptile stores, even a Believe It or Not museum, but there were also touches that made it unique. There was a fortune teller in the lobby of one of the towns, 2 movie theaters, and a pretty good bookstore with a mix of regional histories, nature guides, and even some poetry and magazines. Estes Park seemed to blend frontier charm with a touch of upscale living. The view of the Rocky Mountains made it clear why people were drawn to this place. The idea of frontier and upscale being together didn't seem strange here. In 1984, it felt like the New West was redefining these terms. After dropping off our film at a one-day photo developer, I passed the afternoon exploring curio shops and fishing in a small pond. It was fun, but it didn't feel like the real trip I had in mind. I could tell Bob wanted to spend time with his family, so I tried not to seem restless. He even said he was embarrassed when I played with some of the trinkets in the shops, saying he used to live here and might move back. One night, Bob told me he was out of money. His last assistantship check hadn't arrived, and he was down to just a few dollars. I knew this could mean trouble for our trip. We drove to dinner with Polly and her boyfriend Doug in silence, with the car struggling up Giant Track Mountain. I wondered if Bob might stay in Estes if things got too tight. The dinner turned into a party, and we avoided talking to each other for a few hours. Later, we sat on the hood of the car looking at the moonlit mountains. Bob outlined some backup plans. He said he could drive me to the nearest airport, or maybe we could find jobs in Estes. He even mentioned letting me take his car, though he seemed unsure about that. Polly and Doug let us stay at their place that night. We flipped a coin for the safed and I lost. The next morning, we climbed Giant Track Mountain. It was a perfect day, and despite getting stuck on a cliff, we worked off some of the tension and talked about our options. When we got back to town, we picked up our photos. Most were normal pictures of our trip so far, but one photo stood out. It was a shot of the Pigeon Forge Elvis Presley Heartbreak Motel, but there was a double exposure of 3 nuns, one holding what looked like hedge clippers. Bob and I were both stunned. We couldn't figure out how it happened, but it felt like a sign. We left Estes Park on June 13th. I was happy to be moving on, but I appreciated the time with Bob's family. They had been very welcoming. As we drove out of town, I felt a mix of relief and excitement. The trip could have ended in Estes, but now we were committed to going on. We made our way through Roosevelt National Forest on a winding road. The drive was tense, but it felt like a turning point. Bob and I had been uncertain about our plans, but now we were both determined to finish the trip. Our next stop was my grandmother's apartment in Tucson, Arizona, nearly 1,000 miles away. As we drove, I thought about a trip my family took when I was 6. It was 1968, and we were touring the Rocky Mountains in a travel trailer. I remembered a few things clearly: a cowboy gift shop, a desire to push my sister into a mud pot in Yellowstone, and my mom saying she could live there because it was so beautiful. One night, we parked next to an abandoned gold mine in Central City, Colorado. It was dark, and we decided to spend the night in the trailer. My parents heard a child crying and saw a bright light. They were spooked and couldn't sleep. Later, a Jeep circled our trailer, and they were too scared to look outside. In the morning, there were Jeep tracks in the dust, but no tracks leading to or from the road. My parents were never the same after that night. My mom found a book about local ghost towns a few days later. It mentioned the Glory Hole mine and a story about a boy who fell into the mine and died. The legend said that on some nights, you could hear the boy crying and see the searchlights. I told Bob the story when we visited Central City. He was skeptical, but the mood lightened as we explored the town. We decided to keep driving, and the tension between us eased. The trip was back on, and we were ready for whatever came next. The sun was still up when we walked the quiet streets of Central City. Most of the tourists were leaving, heading back to their cars and campers. The gift shops and ice cream parlors were closing down. Bob and I stopped at an antique store that had old license plates, postcards, and Coke bottles from the 1920s. I asked the man behind the counter what time it was. 7 sharp, he said. "Seems early for all the shops to close, doesn't it?" I asked. The man rubbed his hands on his old apron and shrugged. "And not really. It's still cold up here in the mountains. Tourist season doesn't start until next week or so. Then everything will be open until 9 or 10. He reminded me of a retired postman in a wax museum, just waiting for the busy season to start. I flipped through a shoebox of old postcards. Tourist season, I thought. It made tourists sound like a crop to be harvested, which was probably how the shopkeeper saw it. A family, mom, dad, and 3 little girls burst into the store, making a lot of noise. They started telling the shopkeeper a story, and I couldn't help but listen. The mom, who looked a lot like mine, made a big circle with her hands. "As big as this, I swear to God," she said. The shopkeeper shook his head. "You never know with mountain weather." "Did you get any of it?" the dad asked. "Nope, it rained for about 2 minutes, then it stopped," the shopkeeper replied. "Look outside," the mom said, pointing out the window. "For the love of Pete." The shopkeeper walked to the window and then back to the counter. "I'll be," he said. Bob was laughing silently by the door. He motioned me over. The family's station wagon was covered in tiny, melting hailstones. On our way in, we hadn't seen any rain or hail. "Pretty strange," Bob said. "This will cost a fortune to fix," the mom said, nearly crying. "My God, a fortune." "The insurance will cover it, Susan," the dad said, trying to calm her down. I felt lucky. At first, I thought it was just relief that it didn't happen to us. But later, I realized it made our Central City trip a better story. We wandered around the town's old buildings. Most places were closed, so we looked in windows and visited a wax museum where Bob got a huge ice cream cone. I talked to a talking cowboy statue and told him I had a picture of myself sitting on his lap from when I was a kid. After that, Bob and I went to the parking lot by the Glory Hole Mine. A fine place to sleep, I said, don't you think? Either way, you'll be disappointed, Bob said, slurping his ice cream. Nothing happens or something happens and both are bad. Whatever, we'll see. We headed back to our car, El Basurero. A wooden sign outside the Silver Dollar Saloon caught our eye. Bob said, I'm not ready to drive down these mountain roads. Let's have a beer. Bob didn't really like beer, but he agreed. We sat at the bar and it was almost empty. A few people were playing pinball, and a bearded man in a Stetson was talking to the bartender. We ordered 2 cold Coors, and I went to the bathroom. When I got back, Bob was looking around like he was in a museum. This is the first bar I ever went to, in 1968. No way, I was here in 1968, but not in this bar. When were you here? August. I was here in August too. We could have been sitting right across from each other. The bartender asked if we wanted more beer, and we said yes. Call me Rabbit, he said. Everyone calls me Rabbit, we nodded. The bartender put on the Big Chill soundtrack and told us it was a great movie. We agreed, but I mentioned that a friend of mine thought another movie was better. Hey, they're both great, Rabbit said. But the Big Chill had this music. It felt like I was watching the soundtrack of my own life. Rabbit asked why we were in Central City. Bob tried to pretend he was from around here, but eventually he gave up and told Rabbit about our trip. Rabbit pointed at himself. I've been traveling since 1971. When you're a bartender, you can go anywhere. I keep a list of my former employers in my wallet. I've worked in bars from Jersey to Frisco. I haven't stayed in one place longer than 6 months in forever. He refilled our beers. I just came from Reno. Easy money, but it messes with people's values. I've seen people lose everything and cry in the corner, and winning can be worse. People buy drinks for strangers and light cigars with $50 bills. Rabbit asked if we liked trivia. Bob said he was unbeatable at Trivial Pursuit. I didn't correct him, even though I had beaten him once. Rabbit was a trivia expert and had a stack of trivia books under the bar. We did pretty well, but we struggled with James Bond questions. When we got to sports, I had them both beat. Okay, who was the second black player in the majors, and who was the second black manager? Bob gave up, but Rabbit paced back and forth, muttering. He finally got the player Larry Doby, Cleveland Indians, but not the manager. Rabbit made me swear not to tell him the answer. Bob bought cigars, and Rabbit put on an Elvis Presley greatest hits tape. Rabbit served the pinball players and came back. I know I'll know it when you tell me, he said, but go ahead. Also Larry Doby, Cleveland Indians. Rabbit was shocked. I'll be damned, I should have known that. Where in Ohio are you from? I'm from Northwest Ohio. Bob's from Central. We went to school at Miami. Rabbit laughed. I was engaged to a girl who went to Miami. She was pretty. Her granddad owned a bunch of TV stations. It was a long-distance thing that didn't work out. I was at Youngstown State at the time. Rabbit started talking about his time at Kent State. The semester of the shootings, he said. I wasn't on campus that day. I heard about it on the news. My carpool buddy called and said, classes are canceled tomorrow. I dropped out and left home that day, never to return. Bob started writing a letter to a friend on the bar coasters. I helped him, and my handwriting was big and messy. Outside, it was dark and starting to rain. Rabbit refilled my beer without asking. On the house, he said, for Larry Doby and being a fellow bartender. Thanks, I said. Yep, I haven't been back to Youngstown since. I just got an invitation to my high school reunion. 20 years, can you believe it? We graduated in '79, Bob said. Our schools are having 5-year reunions this summer. 20 years must be something. Fucking A it is, you guys going. No, I'm getting married that day, I said. Congrats, man, I've never had the balls to get married. Thanks. Rabbit poured me another free beer. For my reunion, I'm gonna rent a big black Cadillac and some beautiful women. I'll rent the most expensive tux and refuse to wear a name tag. They'll have to guess who I am. He laughed and pounded the bar. That's style. Bob said he might do the same for his reunion. We finished the letter, snuffed our cigars, and left. I'll see you guys another time, Rabbit called. If not here, then in some other bar, some other place, some other time. The streets were wet, but the rain had stopped. Of all the people I've ever met, Bob said, he was one of them. We got in El Basurero and drove toward Denver. "Hey, wake up," Bob said. "I have a great idea. We have to do this. It's perfect." I rubbed my eyes and tried to figure out where we were. It wasn't an interstate, and it wasn't New Mexico. There were stoplights and truck stops. "Where are we?" I asked. "Denver." "Yes," Bob said, pulling into a Mr. Donut parking lot. "We're going to see Ed Sullivan." Ed Sullivan. Oh, not the Ed Sullivan, but a friend of Bob's who moved to Denver. Bob had mentioned him in Estes. Ed Sullivan might want to join our trip. I went into Mr. Donut and ordered a cream puff. Bob came in and ordered a medium coffee. "What's the scoop?" He has both, bananas and peanut butter, both. Elvis sandwiches in Denver, perfect. Bob and I had been driving for hours, barely stopping. The night before, we visited Ed Sullivan in Denver, and now we were on our way to Tucson. It was just after dawn when I woke up in the backseat of El Basurero, feeling groggy and a bit sick. I asked Bob if he was tired and if I should take over driving. He said he was fine, but eventually agreed to switch places. As I took the wheel, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety about the long road ahead. The morning was quiet, with the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. The landscape was vast and empty, with the snow-capped Sangre de Cristo Range on one side, and the endless road stretching out in front of us. We hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. Suddenly I spotted a man and a little girl on the shoulder of the road. The man was holding the girl's hand with one hand and hitchhiking with the other. I almost stopped, but the car was already so full of stuffed dirty clothes, newspapers, and food wrappers that I didn't think we had room for anyone else. Plus, I had this uneasy feeling that something might be wrong. I kept driving, but the image of the man and the girl stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the idea that we should have help. A few hours later, Bob woke up and noticed the gas gauge was almost empty. We debated whether to stop for gas or try to make it to Santa Fe. Bob was confident we could make it, so I slowed down to a steady 55 mph, trying to conserve fuel. As we got closer to Santa Fe, the gauge kept dropping, and I started to worry. But we made it, and Bob and I celebrated by rolling down the windows and drinking a cold beer as we coasted into a gas station. We filled up and laughed about our close call. The next stop was Truth or Consequences, a town named after a game show. It was a strange place, mostly gas stations and motels. We stopped to call my grandmother and let her know we'd be arriving late. But as we were leaving town, El Basurero's radiator started to overheat. Bob pulled over and went to get some coolant. He worked on the car for a while, and we barely spoke. I felt helpless and guilty, but Bob just kept working, trying to fix the problem. After a couple of hours, Bob managed to get the car running again, but he was cautious. We drove slowly, stopping at every exit to let the car cool down. We decided to take a detour on New Mexico 26, a smooth, empty road that seemed to go on forever. We only stopped once in a tiny town called Nut. It had a bar and a general store, both painted a dull gold. Bob wanted ice cream, but the store was closed, and I went into the bar for a beer. It was a strange place, and everyone was speaking Spanish. I managed to order a beer, but it was a nerve-wracking experience. We left Nut and continued on our journey. Later, we stopped at a rest area for dinner. The only food we had left was peanut butter, grape jelly, and a few slices of bread. We made triple-decker sandwiches and drank lukewarm iced tea. As we ate, we watched the sunset and the landscape change. We crossed the Continental Divide, feeling a sense of accomplishment. As we drove on, we saw billboards for something called The Thing. It was a mystery, and the signs kept popping up, making us curious. We were both tired, but the road was long, and there was still a lot of driving to do. Bob and I stood at the edge of the golf course, the giant Easter Island stone idol towering above us, its illuminated eyes gleaming in the desert night. The statue seemed out of place, but that was the charm of Tucson. Everything was a little offbeat, a little unexpected. "Can you believe we're here?" Bob asked, shaking his head. "This isn't Oxford, Ohio. This is something else." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nostalgia. It's like we've landed in another world, one where giant stone heads and miniature golf go hand in hand. We walked past the statue of an orange longhorn steer. its horns pointing toward the sky. Inside the clubhouse, the decor was a bizarre mix of ancient civilizations and 1960s kitsch. A Buddha statue sat next to a sphinx and a sun god, all watching over the check-in counter. 1962, huh? I said to Bob as we paid our greens fees and picked out our golf balls periwinkle for me. Puce for Bob. That makes sense. The Southwest was the birthplace of blotter acid, or so I read. Maybe this place was a trip even before the trip started. Kath, the girl behind the counter, smiled at us. Have fun out there, and watch out for the spider on the first hole. We stepped outside, and there it was a huge, hairy spider dangling over the cup of the first hole. Bob gave me a playful nudge. Ladies first, he said. I took a deep breath and aimed. My putt evaded the spider's 9 legs, but lipped out. 2 putt, I said, sinking the ball on the next try. Bob stepped up, his eyes fixed on the 25-foot monkey astride the next hole. This isn't Oxford, he repeated, a smile spreading across his face. This is something else entirely. We played through the course, each hole more surreal than the last. There was a mini Eiffel Tower, a Mayan pyramid, and even a replica of the Statue of Liberty, all shrunken down to fit the weird and wonderful world of magic carpet golf. As we finished the last hole, the night sky above us filled with stars. Bob and I sat on a bench near the edge of the course, the soft glow of the stone idol still casting its light over us. You know, I said, this trip has been more than just a journey across the country. It's been a journey through memories, through the people we've lost and the places we've left behind. But it's also been a reminder that there's still so much out there to explore, to laugh at, to be amazed by. Bob nodded, his eyes reflecting the same mix of emotions. It's funny how sometimes the most unexpected places can be the most meaningful. Like the thing, or this golf course. They're not just attractions. They're pieces of the past, pieces of our own stories. We sat in silence for a moment, the desert air cool and still around us. Then Bob turned to me, his voice soft. You think Mimi would have liked this? I smiled, thinking of my grandmother's bright eyes and her love for the strange and the beautiful. I think she would have loved it. She would have been the first one to jump in and play. We stood up, ready to head back to the car, but not quite ready to leave this odd, wonderful place behind. As we walked away, the giant stone idol seemed to watch over us, a silent sentinel of the desert, a reminder of the magic that can be found in the most unexpected corners of the world. And as we drove back to Mimi's condo, the moon high and bright above us, I knew that no matter where our journey took us next, we would always carry a piece of this place, this moment with us.